There was a moment in Christian music history that felt unusual and unexpected and deeply theological, and it rarely gets discussed. And perhaps that's not because it was marginal or fringe, but it's because it didn't fit into any recognized category the church knew how to market. It wasn't worship music, it wasn't CCM, it wasn't polite evangelical or evangelistic pop, it wasn't youth groups sing-along culture, it wasn't, message music. It was too intense, too existential, too apocalyptic, and too British. And it was far too comfortable with the darker spiritual architect of the New Testament than people were really used to hearing. This was Perpetual Defiance by Detritus, released in 1990. And what has struck me even decades later is that this album is not Christian lyrics on top of metal riffs that I was used to hearing in my younger years, but it was a theological structure expressed through sound. So the music and the theology all intertwined. The darkness and the redemption and all of that became part of the music and of the lyrics. It treats Christian doctrine not perhaps as slogans, as we hear in so many contemporary worship songs, but as a psychological pressure or a cosmic, perhaps, confrontation, a moral urgency, and all with a pastoral resolution. The music does not politely illustrate theology, it embodies theology both emotionally and structurally, and even narratively. And these songs just don't tell you what Christians believe, they show what the New Testament feels like when translated into an atmosphere of tension and empathy and conflict and fear and tenderness and triumph. And in other words, if music that is worship music gives you theology as sentiment, then Perpetual Defiance gives you theology as experience. Now, I first bought this album when I was 14 and I was inside Oasis Christian Bookshop. I went in expecting to buy something for my birthday, and at that point, I already owned albums by Stryper and Bloodgood and Shout, and my only worship cassette was Petra Praise. I loved these albums, and I still love them now. The tape section inside Oasis, in this wire rack, was divided into three neat categories. You could have worship, you could have pop, and you could have rock. And the only one of these I cared about was rock. At that point, little 14-year-old me had no idea that I was about to walk out with thrash metal. In fact, I didn't even know what thrash metal was. And I didn't yet understand the lyrical theology. My first three metal albums were evangelistic. They were perhaps altar call rock with confidence, clarity, narrative, and melody. But Detritus wasn't evangelistic in that way. I didn't know who Rodney Matthews was. I didn't realize that his album art that was mythic, apocalyptic, and enchanting was already a visual sermon. So before I even pressed play, the artwork was doing theology, and I had no idea about that. The cover declared, I think, that the universe is contested, that spiritual geography is real, and that biblical imagination is not sentimental, but it can be dramatic and urgent and morally intelligible. I looked at the album cover and thought, gosh, I don't understand this. And today I look at it and go, well, this feels like Hebrews 4. It's alive and sharp and spiritually dangerous. And now I'm 48. I can say and see something that I couldn't when I was 14. It's worth bearing in mind that Detritus themselves, looking back, they were just kids when they made this. They were teenagers and young adults, and they were working inside a musical and theological tradition they barely knew how to describe. And I don't think we should hold their adult selves accountable, either sort of morally responsible for the theological intensity that they created in 1990. But I think somehow also they were on to something. And as I pressed play on this album for the first time, everything change. I would also remind you that I don't hold to all the theology inside this album. Before we go any further, I think it's probably, let's remove this. Let me just show you what I own of this, because I own like 4 different copies. First of all, here I own the original CD, which if you look at there, the Detritus is in sort of orangey brown colors, and that is the Christian release of this album in 1990, recorded in Bridgnorth, where I used to live. And you can tell the Christian version released on white metal Edge Records because it has this orangey brown bit up in the Detritus logo, all designed by Rodney Matthews. Whereas when it came to being released on Under One Flag, which is like a subsidiary of, similar to Enigma and Music for Nations, you get it in the same catalog. You find that they changed the name Detritus to this sort of purple color, which makes it stand out better. And then the first thing I got, here it is, the very first thing, the cassette, which is Under One Flag's version and not the Christian release version. In 2020, so 30 years after it came out, Retroactive Records, who are brilliant, re-released Perpetual Defiance. They remastered it. And can we see that? There it is, Perpetual Defiance, re-released by them on record and CD. I would look on eBay to find any of those if you like. So Perpetual Defiance is not a random set of Christian ideas scattered through these sort of aggressively musical songs. It feels to me like a single theological imagination expressed through a distinct emotive and emotional grammar. So across the whole album, you hear and feel, I think, 8 movements of doctrine. The first one is a self that's never tied in. It's always torn between desire and holiness. It's this Romans 7 internal warfare, and it's not polite. It's not this polite moral failure. Then we have sin not as a bad habit, but as like this spiritual squatter that is a resident force taking up territory inside our mind and our will. And then temptation, not as a sort of curiosity, but as this ignition, that fire that you cannot hold without great consequence. And then there's a mortality, not as this sort of poetry melancholy that you might find in some English literature poems, but as this eschatological countdown, this Hebrews 9 urgency that time is charged and the universe is heading somewhere, and it's heading for this cataclysmic event. And then we have atonement, but not as this soft symbolism, but as this collision where the cross and justice and mercy meet in blood and authority, and then judgment, not as this sort of divine temper, but as this unveiling of truth revealed and illusion and darkness removed, and everything seen finally in the end as it actually is. Then the 7th one is mercy, but not as sentiment, but as this homecoming, a Luke 15 tenderness of identity restored and belonging recovered, and the arms open and the robe ready, and the Father willing and ready to meet the prodigal son. And then the final theme is this Christ victorious, but not as a metaphor, but as like this legal triumph where evil loses its jurisdiction and darkness is evicted, and Christus Victor, with keys in hand, arrives. And this is not a sequence of themes, but it's like this spiritual metabolism that sort of permeates the whole album. And instead of treating them like isolated doctrine of each song is about a certain idea, the album continually circulates them. And it sort of circulates them in anthropology and captivity and eschatology, and this confrontation and tenderness, authority, restoration. And theology sort of becomes mood, and doctrine becomes the atmosphere, and belief becomes experience. And Perpetual Defiance is not so much theology explained like a Bible study. It is theology felt in real time as you listen to it again and again. And I tell you, this is one of the few albums of Christian heavy music that I used to own when I was young that I still listen to, and I still find myself drawn to it, and I still love. So we begin with this idea of the divided self and Romans 7 and this Christian theology that insists that human beings are not spiritually integrated. And Paul describes it in Romans 7 as the good I want to do, I do not do, and the evil I do not want to do, I end up doing. This isn't any moral etiquette. This is like this anthropological fracture, a split between intention and behavior, between desire and obedience, between clarity and compulsion, and between holiness and habit. This is the sound of the human being under pressure. And crucially, Romans 7 isn't really about guilt. Romans 7 is about being captive. The album continually treats sin as a force at work, not a mistake, not a whoopsie-do, but sort of as an invasion, and not as this inconvenience, but this thing that comes and takes over you, and as sort of occupation, something that occupies all your mind, rather than this sort of misbehavior, where, this idea that we inherently want to do good. And you can hear it in the music. There's agitation and dissonance and sort of this restless grind. And the human soul is not in a debate, but it's in a sort of legal jurisdictions struggle of who gets to run your life. And it's this tension constantly between doing the things we want to do and not doing the things that we ought to do. Worship music perhaps often treats sin like an emotional awkwardness or this moral clumsiness, but Perpetual Defiance treats sin like a resident power attempting to colonize the person it lives in. And that, to me, feels far closer to the New Testament than almost anything in contemporary Christian music. We are not confused. We are occupied. So this brings us to this next idea, which is reminiscent of Genesis 6, Romans 1, and Ephesians 6. And Scripture never treats sin as a paperwork exercise. If you read Genesis 6, it portrays humanity as spiritually disordered and increasingly violent. Romans 1 describes rebellion that produces darkened minds and distorted desires and these damaged perception and moral confusion and a spiritual disintegration. If we add to that Ephesians 6, it introduces this spiritual resistance not as a metaphor, but as a structural, intelligent, adversarial presence. Sin as occupation is not a psychological problem. This is agency, and it's not merely weakness. When riffs in this album fragment and rhythms convulse, you hear sin not as guilt, but as a loss of coherence, of this constant fight inside a person. Sin is treated as sort of a deforming of the right mind of a believer. It's a soul separated from God, becoming fragmented, unstable, spiritually disorientated. And it says, man is now a beast. This isn't exaggeration. It is anthropology expressed in sound and lyric. We now arrive at this pastoral heart of Romans 7 and Galatians 5 and deliverance theology, perhaps, something I'm not a massive fan of. If Romans 7 is true, then sin is not simply something we do. It can become something that imprisons us. So sin isn't just behavior, sin is actual captivity. And salvation isn't therapy, it's not CBT, it's not counseling. Salvation is deliverance. It is deliverance from sin. Paul doesn't say, I sometimes mess up. Paul says, there is another power at work within me. I think this is sort of existential honesty that we could do with a bit more in Christianity these days. And then he says, who will deliver me from this body of death? Deliverance is not sentimental. Deliverance is liberation of a spiritual occupying force. Galatians 5 declares that it was for freedom that Christ has set us free. If we have been set free, it implies we were in captivity, and captivity implies warfare, and warfare implies this sort of legal jurisdiction. The entire Christian imagination, I think, begins to make emotional sense when you treat sin as residency rather than misbehavior. And metal expresses deliverance instinctively, not as comfort, but as rescue. And I think it makes sense. It makes sense that metal music, with this sort of dissident difficulty of on the ears, that and the sort of the tone and everything, that makes it feel more attuned to this kind of lyric. So this rescue is not, and deliverance isn't a, what might you call it, a lifestyle improvement. It's not the God-shaped hole. It's not, oh, just add Jesus to your life, won't you be happier? But it is an overthrow of this hostile spiritual presence at work in you. And charismatic theology, I think, one of its great strengths has always understood deliverance as legal. So you don't negotiate with evil and sin. In charismatic theology, evil and sin is evicted. And when the album reaches its climactic authority language, that's exactly what it feels like. It's not this emotional closure, but this legal expulsion. The human being is not being comforted in their sin. The human being is being freed. And it's like Romans 7. Just read Romans 7. If you don't believe me, pause this video and go and read Romans 7 and see that this language is throughout this album. And this is the kind of understanding that they seem to have. So here we are, temptation as combustion or fire. The Bible rarely treats temptation as harmless curiosity. For example, Proverbs 6 says, can a person take fire into their lap and not be burned? Temptation has this volatility. Temptation escalates and temptation consumes. In 2025, I think modern Christian music often treats temptation as this gentle fork in the road. It's one lifestyle or another. Scripture doesn't do any of that. Metal doesn't do that either. Thrash metal communicates sort of temptation as this igniting process, a spiritual accelerant that sets all these trajectories in motion. And I think this is the real pastoral realism inside this album, that temptation is not intellectual, but temptation is combustible. It ignites, it sets fire to things. And temptation, when conceded and given into, it sends you on this road that you don't want to go down. And Detritus do this brilliantly. You know, this bunch of teenagers, or maybe heading to 20 years old, have this understanding of the theology found within the problem of temptation. Then we come to this, Christian theology treats sort of mortality as urgency and not abstraction. If Hebrews 9:27, it was appointed unto man to die once, and after this, the judgment. So death is not this abstract concept. Death is a confrontation with reality. Judgment is not divine temper, but judgment is clarity. You die, you get judged. Truth is unveiled finally. The moral identity is revealed and spiritual architecture is finalized. In addition to the verses in Hebrews, Revelation 12 portrays sort of cosmic adversary and this contested geography. Thrash expresses judgment emotionally, not as melodrama, but as this inevitability, and this album does this great. Distortion collapses normality, acceleration feels like a countdown, breakdowns feel like finality, and the music lends itself to this urgent eschatological sort of trajectory. Worship music, it softens this eschatology, whereas the actual style of music, and I know not everyone likes it, I think that's probably all right, you don't have to like it, but metal gives a sort of eschatological, or gives eschatology its emotional integrity because the songs themselves feel urgent. Atonement is not soft or metaphorical. Again, it's this legal process, but it's also sacrificial. We have Isaiah 53, the innocent suffering for the guilty, Matthew 26 and Luke 22. This is my blood of the covenant. Hebrews 9, cleansing through blood, an actual costly reconciliation. So communion is not intimacy first. Communion with God is this collision where sin is judged, guilt is absorbed, forgiveness is purchased, and darkness loses its legal right within the person. Metal again expresses the cross not as a quiet memory, but as this violent mercy where cosmic justice and cosmic compassion meet simultaneously. So Good Friday is not a sentimental calendar date. Good Friday is like this legal crisis, and Perpetual Defiance lets you feel that, and you feel it deeply. So judgment is not divine rage. Judgment is truth becoming visible. So the idea is you're going to be judged. You need to recognize that according to this album. Matthew 25 treats separation as recognition and the soul finally seen as what it has become. Revelation 20 closes the whole story of history with illusion removed, hypocrisy dissolved, and the spiritual architecture revealed. This album gives judgment this emotional clarity. And metal music in itself does a similar thing. The universe has structure. The universe has moral endpoints, and finality is not melodrama. This isn't frightening. This is honesty. And metal found a way in the 80s and 90s, particularly in thrash metal in the early 90s, to butt up against this and be honest and real about it. But Christianity isn't only about this confrontation and clarity. Christianity is pastoral. The story in Luke 15 has this child returning, and the father runs to meet the child, and a robe is given, and then the sonship of the prodigal son is restored. After distortion, captivity, fear, and judgment, that mercy becomes the oxygen which enables people to breathe again. That this mercy is structural, and that people become, they are now belonging, and reconciliation has happened, and their identity has been restored. That tenderness in that story, it feels real, and it feels earned, and it feels right. And that mercy is not emotional softness, but mercy is this reordering of someone who has been in one place and has been in rebellion, like we all have at times, and that mercy is found and you come back and return to the Father. Now, I do wonder sometimes if the church is any good at this, because it's, whilst people are, restored personally back to Christ, I wonder if, the evangelical church in itself is too quick to throw people under the bus if they don't fit their neat narrative. And here is the good news of the album in Luke 10, Ephesians 6, and Revelation 12. The climax of Christian theology is not this little whimper, but is this legal triumph. It is Christ's victory. Evil is not merely resisted, but evil is permanently evicted. In Luke 10:19, we see this delegated authority. In Ephesians 6, we see this structured spiritual opposition. And then in Revelation 12, we see the adversary who was there from the beginning, that Genesis 3 cast down. So deliverance isn't a metaphor. Deliverance is a legal expulsion with Christ victorious and Christ winning. And the metal, particularly in this album, expresses that with precision, but it's not full of rage. It's full of authority. The sound isn't anger, but the sound is the eviction. It's not emotional closure, but a spiritual triumph. I'd say this, that Perpetual Defiance is a sort of theological exorcism in sonic form. And that really, if I was to distill the album into one idea, that would be it. But we must pause, I think, and appreciate one other thing about this album and British Christian heavy metal in general, and that is the brilliance of Rodney Matthews. His artwork is always theological without quoting a verse. Matthews paints enchanted worlds, this spiritual geography, a moral atmosphere. It has prophetic confrontation, and it has revelation without cliche, and a cosmos that feels charged and alive. His use of color in his work seems eschatological. There's gold for triumph, and blue for transcendence, and red for conflict, and green for the spiritual landscape. His artwork declares that the world is spiritually inhabited, and the visible is not the whole of the world. When you set his artwork beside thrash metal, Doctrine, as it were, becomes atmosphere. I don't know how I looked at the album cover and didn't realize there was something different about it, because all the other ones I'd had up to that point all had the big-haired boys, the big-haired band, men from the band, on their front cover. But you're not told this is theology. I think you feel it. You feel it before a lyric is sung. But a 14-year-old me, I found this album cover intoxicating. It was because of the album cover that I bought it, but I had no idea why. Rodney Matthews made Christianity dramatic. He refused to let the spiritual world be ornamental or kitsch. He made it, urgent, inhabited, contested, and morally intelligible. His art in itself is evangelism without any sentimentality. It's the gospel in color and tension and scale. And in order to understand Detritus and Seventh Angel and the British Stairway maybe as well, and the British heavy metal scene, we need to understand part of its historic background. Detritus are not American. Most Christian metal heard in Britain at this time was American, and the most popular being Striper, Bloodgood, Shout, White Cross. Perhaps King's X found themselves, as they might call it today, accidentally in that category. But this music was melodic and confident and evangelistic, and some of it theatrical. But British metal has a real different spiritual DNA. It emerges from the post-industrial West Midlands of Wolverhampton, Birmingham, Walsall, Hales, Owen, and it's the birthplace of Black Sabbath and Judas Priest and half of Led Zeppelin. And it's really the ground zero of heavy metal, not just in Britain, it is the birthplace of heavy metal. The industrial landscape of the West Midlands of the 80s and 90s, early 90s, had this sort of economic decline, urban grit, religious memory, a post-Christian mood, a moral seriousness, but biblical imagination without sentimentality. And British metal inherits that sort of emotional weather and geography. It doesn't come from the suburbs of California or the optimism of Nashville. It comes from environments where life is hard, faith feels dramatic, the spiritual feels real, and the apocalypse maybe feels like it's already started. Whereas American Christian metal is evangelistic, British Christian metal is anthropological and apocalyptic. It's not the Jesus loves you first, it's the world is spiritually contested. Sin is captivating. Death is the enemy. Judgment is coming. Deliverance is real, and Christ has authority. And Detritus are part of that lineage. Perpetual Defiance is not the youth group pep rally. It's a prophetic anthropology with guitars. It is Christianity stripped of sentimentality and given back its existential weather. The whole album can be summarized in one theological arc: a divided self, sin as occupation, temptation as combustion, mortality as urgency, atonement as confrontation, judgment as unveiling, mercy as reconciliation, and Christ as the victorious authority. None of this is fringe theology. Much of it is classic orthodoxy, but it's expressed emotionally, honestly, and dramatically. This album does not distort theology, but the metal music gives the theology an emotional realism. Sin becomes conflict, death becomes mockery, judgment becomes clarity, mercy becomes tenderness, and victory becomes expulsion. If worship music turns Christianity maybe into therapy, then Perpetual Defiance turns Christianity back into apocalypse, deliverance, battle, resurrection. And to me, that feels much closer to the emotional temperature that we read in the New Testament. When I bought the album at 14, I didn't understand the theology. I simply felt that Christianity suddenly had emotional scale and this existential seriousness and this cosmic tension and pastoral beauty all at once. It didn't feel like religion. It felt like apocalypse and revelation and with guitars. It felt like doctrine that could breathe and sweat and confront and comfort. It felt like the cross was not just this illustration, but this cosmic collision. And decades later, I still think this is one of the most honest, emotional renderings of biblical theology ever recorded inside Christian music. Perpetual Defiance gives scripture the emotional realism that it deserves. And I think if you were to let it, you would hear that it still sounds astonishingly good and astonishingly relevant, even to this day. God bless.